the priests and priestesses active in that sanctuary believed that they had received the initiatory lineage directly from the deity itself 1,000 years before, and therefore they were responsible for the continuity of the tradition. So faced with suppression of these types of rites by Theodosius I towards the end of the 4th century, and then the subsequent sacking of the sanctuary itself by Christian monks, they were faced with a conflict between the practicalities of the Eleusinian rites, which had been tightly connected with the civic authorities in Athens for centuries, and the need for them to find a way forward so that the initiatory lineage would not be lost. And what they did effectively is transpose the rites from the massive sanctuary at Eleusis to a series or a group of villas in Athens, and effectively kick-started the Western esoteric tradition as we now understand it.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore magic, folklore, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome back the one and only Peter Mark Adams for his third appearance on the Spirit Box to discuss his new book, Hagia Sophia, Sanctum of Kronos, Spiritual Descent in an Age of Tyranny. In the book, Peter presents a remarkable study of the esoteric beliefs and spiritual traditions contained within the architectural and decorative features of Istanbul's iconic Hagia Sophia. Conventional history recounts that the Hagia Sophia was built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I after the destruction of its namesake during the Nika riots in 532 AD, and that it was intended to be the Christian cathedral of Constantinople, having been designed by the Greek mechanicos Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles. I've had to record me saying those names several times now, so that's the best you're going to get. That's the best I can do here. Anyway, Hagia Sophia, Sanctum of Kronos tells the story of the building's hidden purpose: to conceal and preserve a sacred mystery in the face of rising Christian tyranny, right under the nose of Constantinople's Christian ascendancy. Represented in the sacred geometry, light, materials, and architecture of this astounding and powerful building, this sacred teaching is revealed by Peter in his remarkable thesis. As with Peter's previous books, this is meticulously researched, captivating, and it's an illuminating piece of work. The book itself is punctuated with carefully selected, evocative photography and illustrations, and that really helps get to the esoteric heart of what Peter is laying out for us. And very kindly, Peter has given us some of these images, which will be in the YouTube version of the show. So it's definitely worth checking out the show on YouTube. If I can just finish with a quote from Peter before we get into it. Culturally, the structure acts as a repository for the metaphysical preoccupations of a Hellenistic culture that evolved from the great mystery cults of antiquity to become the metaphysical engine of subsequent European thought. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the importance of this building in both a literal and a figurative sense, and hopefully gives you an idea of the treat you're in for today with this interview. Now, in the Plus show, we discuss why Saturn is a focal point of Peter's research and work, and how spirit plays a part in his creative process. We get into his next project in this Saturnian current, and Peter goes through some of the areas of exploration for him in this new work, particularly around providence and faith. And we wrap up the show on the subject of energy work and healing, and how this is foundational to Peter's work and indeed his life. Now, if you want to hear the Plus show, it's very simple to do so. Simply join the Patreon and get the entire Plus show, back catalogues, and all the bonus extras. And if you're watching this on the YouTubes or any other video platform, you know the drill. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. Right, that's it from me. Let's get on with the show. Right, it is my great pleasure to welcome back to the show for a third time a true scholar and a gentleman, Mr. Peter McAdams. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Dara. Lovely to be back on with you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, so the subject of the show today is your new work, glorious work, which I had the pleasure to read myself in the last month. Hagia Sophia, the Sanctum of Kronos, Spiritual Descent in an Age of Tyranny. First off, congratulations on completing a wonderful.
Thank you.
Really, really lovely. And you know, I hugely enjoyed the book. It is remarkable. And while I'm setting up the audience with all these teasers, could you give us a brief outline of what the book is, and we'll get into the meat and bone of it?
Yeah, maybe just reprise how it came about.
Yeah.
Not only do I live near the building and have done for many, many years, but I was triggered by an essay by Anthony Caldelis, a prominent scholar, especially of late antiquity. And he'd written an essay about the designers of the building, which really intrigued me because he kind of traced their intellectual milieu back to Alexandria and to specifically to a couple of teachers active in Alexandria in the late 5th, early 6th century. And what intrigued me was that these teachers were clearly aligned with a spiritual movement, which I again trace back to Athens. And it was at this point that I realized that the spiritual tradition was a hangover or a projection, if you like, of the mysteries of Eleusis, which had been one of the greatest centers of mystery rites in the ancient world for almost like 1,000 years. And so putting this history together, I realized that, the sanctuary had been sacked late in the 4th century, and that the priests and priestesses active in that sanctuary believed that they had received the initiatory lineage directly from the deity itself 1,000 years before, and therefore they were responsible for the continuity of the tradition. So faced with suppression of these types of rites by Theodosius I towards the end of the 4th century, and then the subsequent sacking of the sanctuary itself by Christian monks, they were faced with a conflict between the practicalities of the Eleusinian rites, which had been tightly connected with the civic authorities in Athens for centuries, and the need for them to find a way forward so that the initiatory lineage would not be lost. And what they did effectively is transpose the rites from the massive sanctuary at Eleusis to a series or a group of villas in Athens, and effectively kick-started the Western esoteric tradition as we now understand it. And that really is what triggered me to start looking at the building again, given this kind of lineage, this exalted spiritual tradition. What were the connections between all of the people on the chain, the golden chain from Athens to Alexandria to Constantinople? And had that spiritual tradition manifested itself in the architecture of the building? And that's where I came as really the starting point to a reevaluation of the architecture and decorative design.
And indeed, that kind of framing of who the individuals were, who were the Mechanoi, if I'm pronouncing
Mechanicos, yeah.
I was going to say, if I pronounced that correctly, I'll clearly not. That will continue as a theme throughout, me mispronouncing the Greek. So we'll hand over to you, the expert on that instance. But the two the two designers involved,
designers.
yeah, of the building, and you tracked back, again inspired by this essay, their metaphysical lineage,
Yeah.
and there's a piece you talk about in the book, this idea of a golden chain of Diadochi. I put some welly into that pronunciation, and that's why I landed that one. But the idea of these reincarnated beings, or these beings, these souls who come back to Earth to move the teaching on, to ensure that there's a hereditary person for taking on this teaching, that's part of the metaphysical background of these individuals. I know they are not um, Theodokia, if I'm correct in that, but they are part of that lineage in terms of that teaching.
Yeah, I mean, I think what surprised me is that the metaphysics of this process is described or scattered through Plato's dialogues. So
Mm,
it's all there if you can
yeah.
kind of whittle it out. But what surprised me is to find that the people within this tradition had those beliefs.
Mm,
And that for me cast a fresh light on Plato, because he was clearly enunciating a tradition, a metaphysical and spiritual tradition, which was alive within the mystery tradition, within the priesthoods,
mm,
and especially the ancestral priesthoods. Okay. So we always think of kind of Plato as self-standing in terms of his metaphysics and everything, but this exercise clearly showed me that he was articulating a point of view which was alive within the sanctuaries.
right.
And when the sanctuaries were destroyed and the teaching and practices were suppressed, they generated a form of lineage, of a continuity of lineage that allowed their beliefs, their core beliefs, to be articulated in a much clearer way.
Mhm,
So that what we see is that the last hereditary hierophant of Eleusis, his name was Nestorius, and his son, Plutarch of Athens, who was a priest of Asclepius, took the granddaughter, Asclepigenea, and taught her how to practice and teach theurgy, and empowered her with the initiatory tradition of Eleusis. So that despite the fact the sanctuary was gone, the rites were gone after 1,000 years, she was effectively in this villa context still providing the core initiation.
right.
She was in effect a high priestess of the Eleusinian mysteries, despite the fact that they were no longer connected to Eleusis. So
Right.
she was directly giving the initiation to the deities of Eleusis. And what they had set up in the villa is a teaching program that was based on spiritual accomplishment, supported by key texts that they felt helped to develop the qualities necessary to achieve henosis, or union with the deity.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were articulating this archaic tradition in a new way, in a way in which we'd probably recognize it from a modern context and setting. Okay, so they had an initiation, they had practice and teaching in how to recover the initiatory moment through theurgy, and then they had a teaching program that supported that. So a huge emphasis on mathematics, it has to be said. The practical working out of, for instance, Euclid's geometry was part of the training. It was not all textual. After Euclid, you would have like the Chaldean oracles and the Orphic hymns. So all of this is what I would call operative study.
Right.
Okay, it's directly related to practice. And then on top of this, they built up a thing. It actually came from Iamblichus, another great teacher of theurgy in Syria and Asia Minor. And he'd elaborated the four virtues into a 7-step developmental program.
Mhm.
And again, this is something, as far as I can see, is unique. You didn't need this when the sanctuaries were operating. Okay, but once they had ceased to operate, and you then have this kind of urban setting for the teaching, they began to elaborate the teaching in a way in which we haven't seen before. So they had a 7-step developmental program, and for each of the 7 steps, they selected one of Plato's dialogues that they felt was conducive to developing the qualities at that step. The 7 steps were designed to bring you into union with the deity as the outcome of the teaching process. Okay, so it was a mystical and spiritual program.
Yeah.
It was not a question of doing textual study somewhere. It was not like that. Despite the fact that, you know, the school in Athens attracted some of the most formidable intellects of the age. People like Proclus, for instance, were drawn there, and he was initiated by Asclepiagenaea and taught clergy. And the pair of them actually were like a mainstay of that school throughout the 5th century. They both died within a year of each other around 485. The succession of the school was passed on another decade, and then finally the authorities, the Christian authorities, managed to force its closure.
Right.
And at that point, the School of Athens was pretty well no more, as far as we can tell, despite the fact that Michael Purcellus says the initiation was still going on in the 9th century.
Mm.
Now, I can't find a proof of that, but
Yeah.
he does claim it. But what had happened is that many of the students at the school had come initially from Alexandria and had returned to Alexandria when they completed their training, so that the tradition, so to speak, picked up and continued there. One of Proclus's most or best students, let's say, had continued at the school of Horapollo, which was a pagan school, teaching in Alexandria. And his student and then successor at the school, Eutychius, both of them were amongst the leading mathematicians of their day. And because of that, they attracted people entering the engineering profession. Now, in those years, there were like 3 levels to engineering as professionals. You had like the what they call the architectus at the bottom. These were master builders, essentially. And above them, architectos, and these would be, geometras. These would have been what we recognize today as, I think, as professional architects. And then above them, a tiny core of people doing original scientific research. And this group, the Mechanikos, had close ties to schools of philosophy, were conducting scientific research, and also were called in when the engineering problems were of a sufficient complexity and difficulty to require their expertise. So it was a real elite at the very top of the professional ladder there. The 2 Mechanikos who studied with Eutychius in Alexandria were specialists, respectively, in optics and acoustics. Okay, the mathematics and qualities and design of reflective surfaces, and on the other side, vaults. And vaulting is all the supporting structures, domes, arches, semi-domes, and pendentives, and so on, and the stereometry, the mathematics of 3-dimensional objects. And so these 2 Mechanikos were brought to Constantinople and ordered by Justinian to design a replacement for the old Hagia Sophia, which had burnt down in the riots in 532. And that really brings us to the kickoff, so to speak, because they were faced with this vast space that had been cleared. They had an order to build in double quick time a church that would exceed every other, that would exceed the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the fabled temple, and as I say, to do it in double quick time. So essentially, I sat down, I began to think, well, if you were faced with a task like that, what kind of theme would you use to organize your thoughts? Where would you start? You had certain architectural forms that were more or less standard in that day and age, but you needed to go beyond those, and you needed a theme. And that's where the exploration had done into their intellectual and metaphysical milieu and its spiritual implications began to suggest certain answers that allowed me to look at the architecture and look at the decorative design of the building as it stands today and begin to perceive those features.
Excuse me. Reflecting on the two mechanicoi, I'll give up.
That's
All right, okay. Reflecting on kind of their,
the
their,
designers,
their capability.
yeah,
Like, this is the thing that I find really staggering, just from a practical point of view.
yeah,
And really, the kind of the photography in the book, which is beautifully selected. I mean, really, as a kind of an ex-pro myself, the imagery, the selection in the book is the best. It's the best photography, from an photo editor perspective. It is the best use of photography I've ever seen in an esoteric book. It is truly, truly excellent. The selection and how it supports the text is just superb. I'll come back to that, but because it really lands the point about light and the use of light in that building, and deconstructing what the designers set out to achieve as kind of one of those key components in the design, made me reflect on just the unbelievable intellectual capability. How did they map out, design these components before it was put together? And you build this beautifully in terms of, you talk about kind of the like the Pythagorean shapes that go into to mapping out the building, and how you got the whole idea of is it the procession of shape,
yeah,
which is again remarkable. But it really got me into the headspace of just thinking about, like, well, we use advanced 3D modeling, and we can run simulations, we can create parameters within software to kind of essentially design. Okay, we think light will behave this way, but often we find we're maybe kind of be out by a degree, even with kind of these advanced simulations. But it really got me into the headspace of the intellectual capacity of these individuals to be able to essentially do all this in pure mathematics and in pure illustration, and then bring it to life.
I mean, the dome itself is 32 meters in diameter.
Yeah.
It weighs something like 1,300 metric tons, and it's raised 50 meters in the air.
Yeah.
Onto the piers, so that, I mean, this is this is before there were the kinds of cranes that we would, be dealing with. So the engineering is of a level and a quality conceptually and in terms of its execution we wouldn't see again for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
This building was finished 527. It was put up in something like 4.5 years from scratch, right?
Which is unheard of.
It's still standing, and you won't see a building like it till the medieval cathedrals, 1,000 years later almost.
Yeah.
And what it does is open our eyes to the depth and the profound understanding of a culture, that kind of disappeared in the Dark Ages. I had this experience also when I wrote Misdai, and looking at the frescoes, looking at the modeling of the figures, the figuration. And that was like in the 1st century CE. Well, you wouldn't see figuration like that again until the Renaissance. So, the steep declines of culture and spirituality are like factored into this. So
yeah, it absolutely, those things are intertwined. Well, what it brought back to me is we have essentially the elite of their day in their areas of expertise or professional expertise, building this incredible structure in a condensed time frame against a backdrop of religious intolerance and tyranny.
yeah,
And what they managed to achieve is just staggering. But it harks to the, for me, it gives me an insight into kind of the strength of their own, like, spiritual beliefs.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
it really does.
yeah. I think for me, it highlighted the fact that their spirituality was not of a religious kind. That's
Hmm.
to say, it was not doctrinal.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, it's what today we would call imagistic. That's to say, it's experiential first and foremost, and your experience is good enough for you.
Mhm.
You know, there's not, so to speak, a standard being set.
Yeah.
There's not a set of beliefs that you must adhere to. And there's not like a hierarchical priesthood there to enforce belief.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's like an inverted triangle when compared to the Christian
Hmm.
pyramid, so to speak,
Yeah.
with its top down, its canonical texts, and its determinate interpretation of those texts.
Yeah.
Okay, and everyone has to follow, otherwise you end up in hell, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, this is like that pyramid turned upside down. So first and foremost is the primacy of your own contact and connection with the divine. And it's that experiential start which then should guide you to develop your spirituality. Okay. And this, I say, is characteristic of what we would today call imagistic
Hmm.
forms of spiritual
Hmm.
belief and practice. And this tradition was profoundly imagistic. It had initiation at its core that actually introduced you to the deity. Okay, and then the light that filled you from that should be sufficient then to guide you forward as you then start to bring the elements of your life into line with that experience, modifying your behavior, your consumption, and what you do in life to find an alignment with that original source of inspiration. So clearly, this type of tradition underpinned the designer's life, their lifestyle. So when they wanted to think about what they were about to do from a thematic perspective, they started thinking in terms of, for instance, the great Pythagorean creation process, which it's outlined, for instance, in Plato's Timaeus.
Hmm.
You know, and Plato's Timaeus, it's called a dialogue, but actually it's like a monologue of a visiting Pythagorean
Yeah.
who is like
Hmm.
talking about his beliefs and how they view creation as this mathematical and geometrical progression,
Hmm.
which is ensouled, so that everything is in proportion. And the geometry of this is like from a point to a circle to a semicircle to a square. And when you look at the building, it's exactly the way, top down, that the basic geometric structures fall out from the vast dome. Okay. So, you know, once you have that spiritual logic, so to speak, the emanation of creation, you can immediately see, oh, yeah, that's how the. So, reversing it, you start from a basal square, and within the square, you inscribe a circle. And when you split the circle in two, you get two semidomes. And you know, as you raise this up on massive stone pillars to make it into a three-dimensional shape, you need arches to join the four pillars together, and that creates a triangular shape in the gap between the arches, which is the pendentive, and that creates the circle, and on the circle you can mount the dome.
Hmm.
Okay, so once you get this geometrical progression from Plato's Timaeus. You can run the scenario back and forth. The rest of it is getting the weights and stresses and strains correct. Okay, that's big stuff, because the entire integrity of the building rests on that. And they're doing this before there was, any way of measuring these things. This is where you needed the master builders with deep experience to work with the architects and the designers to get this right. I'll just mention this as one of the curious features of the building. If you look at any piece of modern brickwork, you'll see that the mortar between the bricks is like a centimeter max. And then there's like, 3.5 inches of brick, something like that. If you look at the Hagia Sophia, the mortar is larger than the brick. Okay, so the brick is very thin at like 1.5 inches, and then there's like 3 inches of mortar around it. And when they've tested the mortar recently, they found that it's still chemically active. Okay, so what this means in a seismic zone is that when tremors pass through the ground, the whole building shakes like a large jelly, basically.
Yeah.
And can absorb seismic tremors without disrupting the foundations and fabric.
Extraordinary.
That said, the weight of the building is such as pressed down and shifted a lot. And about 25 years after the inauguration, there were a series of very powerful earthquakes, topical subject these days. And one of the semi-domes had a partial failure. So a decision was then taken to rebuild the dome for safety's sake.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they did this also alerted me to something very important. The original dome had been designed to be almost flat, okay, a shallow concave shape. And we know that the safest dome is the steepest dome, because that way all of its weight is transferred vertically down into its supporting members. The shallower it is, the more lateral force it exerts. It tends to push its supporting members out. The fact that these designers had gone for such a flat design alerted me to something very important. They had gone for, from an engineering perspective, a suboptimal design solution in order to achieve a metaphysical end. And you'll recall that one of the mechanicus was an expert in reflective surfaces. Okay, and this is the reflection of light and sound. And this brings us into another dimension of the designer's thinking. Because in the ancient world, there was a far more panpsychic or animist view of reality, so that all matter is permeated with soul, substance, basically. Consciousness is distributed through everything. And that being the case, matter can exert a force on a space, and anyone in that space can feel that force. So there's some of these forces are thought to have been supernatural forces that imprinted, for instance, designs into the marble. All the veins that run through it are like an imprint. They had a spiritual significance in and of themselves. So this is the Santa Mater, the fact that substance is in some sense alive, and that when you assemble related substances together, just as a magician will assemble the right incense, the right colors, the right so on and so forth, flowers or whatever, the assemblage of related materials has so to speak, an accelerated or accentuated force to it, a symbola. And finally, it has an intrinsic meaning from the fact of its creation, demiurgic creation, a hieropoiesis. It has an intrinsic meaning. So that pattern and shape all are alive in a sense in which it's difficult for us to adjust to and think in those terms today. Okay, given that light itself was infused with spiritual force, light and sound, by the way, because when we talk about reflective surfaces, and this building was optimized to be as reflective as possible, it was in order to activate a spiritual force within its nous, within its main massive vault. Okay, and one of the curious features of this building is that it has no embedded Christian imagery in it whatsoever for the first, like, I don't know, 900 years, as far as I can tell.
Yes,
The first images, embedded imagery, came with the mosaics. I think the earliest is 9th century or something like that. So it's at least 400 or 500 years after the inauguration of the building. And for the main church of Christendom, that's extraordinary.
It really
Like when you
Yeah.
compare it to the intense concentration of churches and tombs and what have you in Ravenna, the Byzantine capital of Italy, which almost certainly the same designers, the same craftsmen working on Hagia Sophia would have worked on those churches as well. And they are laden from head to toe with Christian imagery.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's two entirely distinct aesthetic regimes at work, one for the Hagia Sophia and one for everything else. And that's another extraordinary fact that nobody seems to have really talked about up to now. And
It's staggering. It really
the
is.
third extraordinary fact is that, you see, they've coated these massive stone pillars on which the dome is resting, you know, thousands of tons of weight. They coated these massive stone pillars in what's called marble revetment. And that's done by taking a block of marble, carefully chosen, you know, and you slice it like a loaf of bread. And then you polish the front of the first slice and the back of the second slice, front of the third slice and the back of the fourth slice. And then when you lay these panels out and turn them around and match them to each other, they generate, the veins running through the entire marble block generate patterns. And by careful selection and trimming of the panels, you generate shapes. Now, here's the extraordinary thing. Every other Byzantine revetment I've seen in a church or in Ravenna or even in Constantinople back in 12th, 13th century has put like 4 of these panels together and created this wonderful, beautiful Rosetta shape. Okay, so it's harmonious.
Yeah.
Symmetry. Symmetry, again, has a force in Byzantine and late antique thought. Asymmetry has the opposite effect. And what they've done in Hagia Sophia is to create asymmetrical marble revetment reaching up 30, 40 meters, covering the 4 massive supporting piers. Okay. And we can illustrate that by looking at some of the examples, because when I look at them, they look exactly like arachnids or scorpions.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is so extraordinary. I can't believe nobody's talked about this before. And certainly in the broader context of Byzantine church design and architecture, it's amazing. And that also triggered me thinking, well, it's so deliberate, it's so systematic across all 4 piers and at least 2 levels on each pier appear to depict these kind of arachnid figures. That's like 5 to 6 figures per pier. Okay, which is like something like 20 to 24 of these arachnid-like shapes looking down at you. And they're quite distinct from the decorative panels, which are just beautiful swirly shapes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final kind of clue. So we got this flat dome, and it's covered in gold tesserae. That's to say, they took a large sheet of glass, they covered it in real gold foil, put a thin sheet of glass on top of it and then baked it so it fused. And then they cut it up into these like small 1 centimeter tesserae, mosaic pieces. And they placed them into the ceiling space in plaster and angled them. 10,000 square meters of it.
Wow.
180 per square meter. And they're all placed individually and angled to create a reflective surface. And the sills that let light into the building at the top have silver tesserae on the sills, so that they're reflecting light from the sky up onto the ceiling and then down. So you have this golden glow infusing the center. And given, as I say, the understanding of light and this kind of panpsychic view, you're infusing the building with an active spiritual current, essentially, with this architecture. The reflectivity, let's talk about the acoustics briefly. You know, most performance spaces have like a 2-second sustain or reverberation. Okay, the sound dies away that quickly, and it needs to. Otherwise, you have multiple echoes and so on. Hagia Sophia was designed to have a 12 to 14 second sustain on its sound. Okay, and that's massive. When you consider all the domes, semi-domes, and a cathedral were filled with choirs, so that, you know, as they sing, their words are lost, and you end up with this vibration, this tremendously powerful vibration echoing back and forth through this vast chamber. And if people want to experience what that is like, they should listen to the Icons of Sound short clip on YouTube. Okay, this is a recording done by Stanford. They were allowed to pop a balloon in the center of Hagia Sophia and then use the pattern of sound that emerged from that to generate a computer program that replicates that. So they then took the Stanford choir and had it sing a Byzantine hymn and ran that through this simulator of the Hagia Sophia's acoustic signature.
Yeah.
So listening to Icons of Sound, you can get an idea of just how powerfully spiritual the space was in terms of its acoustic as well as its lighting. Okay.
That's just remarkable.
And so if I can just finish, the final element that, you know, drew me in is the fact that the vast marble floor is being laid with marble panels to resemble a sea. You know, everyone who's kind of commented on this over the centuries has described it as a sea. And across this sea, there's kind of asymmetrical marble, green marble inlays running across the floor. Okay, and again, most people have said, well, it's like rivers, but nobody could say which rivers they were. But as part of my tracking of the intellectual milieu of the designers, I understood that if they had designed, so to speak, top down the geometry from Plato's Timaeus, then the scorpion-like revetment, the sea and its 4 rivers must also have a source, most likely in Plato, and I found it there. The 4 rivers, well, the sea is the underworld, which is the Hellenistic underworld, the afterlife, and Tartarus specifically, which has 4 named rivers in Plato's dialogues. So I then grasped the fact that what they were doing is creating a theme based around the Hellenic afterlife. Okay, so it went from like Tartarus at the bottom with the scorpions, who are like the retributive element, because, you know, souls who are sent down to Tartarus, depending on their kind of guilt, let's say, will be cleansed in one of the 4 rivers, unless they're tyrants, that is, in which case they fall into this and never come out again. So it was significant that, you know, the lower part of the building absolutely represents this what today we would call hell. And then at the middle, the gallery all of a sudden turns into like this green meadow with flowers. And I understood again in the standard model of the Hellenic afterlife, that is the meadow of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's where, so to speak, the decision is made whether you're going to be consigned to hell or you're going to be allowed to go on to the age, the Tower of Kronos, it would have been called, the Isles of the Blessed. Okay, and you recall it has this gold ceiling. That gallery, that meadow of judgment, is where the court would have sat during Mass. Okay, so they were placed in the meadow of judgment, looking down into the underworld below. And that way, I think the designers were able to, so to speak, make a dissenting statement.
Yeah.
But of a spiritual nature, not of a political nature so much. It's about tyranny, and it's about how far you can or should go as a ruler. And the building kind of embodies that.
It really does, isn't it? You know, and I mean, they are like sitting in that kind of space, you know, thematically awaiting judgment while looking at the towers beneath.
Yeah.
It's the whole. I mean, again, you know, congratulations. It's a tremendous piece of work, and you've really built out an incredible thesis here. You know, it's staggering. I come back to these individuals again and again because, not least because of the brilliance, you know, which you've unpacked for us today in so many disciplines. But I often think about it in terms of, you know, anybody who's run a project for a client, no matter how small, knows how challenging some elements can be.
Yeah.
How the hell did they get so many, like, just ideas, like structural design, acoustics, all the way, you know, like past that I guess Justinian's, for want of a better term, you know, team on this, like, you know, for those of you who've worked in client services, understand the complexity of managing expectation, but on this scale,
Yeah.
you know,
The extraordinary thing is they had to make all the bricks.
yeah,
You know, they had to build kilns in Constantinople. They had to ship in massive quantities of raw materials.
yeah,
And that would include, for instance, tons of wood
of
for the
course,
kilns.
yeah.
Okay, so you needed to have everything would come in as raw material. Only the marble blocks would have been shaped a certain degree in the quarries.
Yeah.
Okay, they would have come in, but still they had to be cut down. They had to selection process, the trimming, you know, the slicing of them into panels. These like 1 centimeter thick panels, and then you have to build and make all the saws for that.
Yeah.
There isn't a B&Q to go to. Okay, you have to make your saws.
Yeah.
And for the saws you need, you know, whatever cutting. You need tons of sand to help the cutting. You know, you need lime, you need dust, you need marble dust to make the glass bricks, tons of wood. The scaffolding must have been absolutely tremendous to bear the kinds of weights that they were lifting 50 meters above the ground. Okay. So, as you say, how you begin organizing all of this so that the thing comes together in a few short years and stands for the next 1,500 through earthquakes, fire, storm, invasions, conquests.
Empires rising and falling.
Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal.
It's staggering.
Phenomenal.
you know, and
I
then
don't know where you'd begin with the project management. So
no, it would be it would be horrendous. It'd be it'd be horrendous. But just the I'm wondering, is it like, was the sheer scale of the undertaking, you know, and the fact that it was time boxed so aggressively. You know, bear
yeah,
in mind, we look at kind of, as you alluded to earlier at the start of the show, you know, we wouldn't see anything of that scale until 1,000 years later for European cathedrals, and those were
yeah,
built over, you know, 100 plus years, like
mm, yeah,
far longer time scale. Uh,
yeah,
so it was almost like this was such a time pressured initiative, and that maybe they been able to get this building erected in such a condensed period of time was that feather in Justinian's cap. What he didn't realize what was going on.
yeah.
When
I
I'm,
mean,
you know,
I think for him, you know, they could probably sell the lack of
Mm,
embedded Christian imagery because the church at that time was split between different like
right,
monophysites,
yeah,
Arians, and like you have Antioch and you have Alexandria, and the
yeah,
bishops there won't listen to the bishop in Constantinople, and there's constant battle going on about the nature of Jesus or
yeah,
the nature of the Trinity and so on. And this is kind of wound into the politics of the time.
yeah,
Okay, so if this was going to be the church of all Christendom, allow Justinian to stamp his like imprimatur on the empire, it had to have marbles from every corner of the empire. He would be looking for that, and they did that.
yeah,
It would also have to be kind of generalizable in terms of its appearance so that everyone can say, yes, we accept that as, the church of churches, so to speak.
mhm,
So in a sense, I can see how the project was sold.
right,
But then when you consider the like intellectual fissure that ran through Byzantine society, so on the one hand, you had the educated, the civil service, the professionals, and all of them had gone through the same classical education process. So they were imbued with Hellenistic ideas
mhm,
because it's inextricably wound into education. And then there's the theologians who've gone through a Christian theological background, and that was true of Justinian himself.
yeah,
His uncle, who he succeeded, was illiterate. He was a swineherd from Balkans. So, like Justinian was the first in the family who had a decent education, but it was wholly in theology.
right,
And like his major objectives were unite the empire, restore the borders to the Roman Empire, um, synthesize all the disparate laws into a unified legal system, which in fact became the basis for the European legal system,
right,
because of his initiative, um, and hold everything together whilst you still have the old Roman aristocracy snapping at your heels. And that, this is talk about time consuming.
mm, mhm, mhm,
His army went off and they spent a phenomenal amount of money to try and restore the borders.
yeah,
Ultimately, of course, it bankrupted them, as an empire's military spending always does.
yes, yeah,
It's it's going to happen, and
yeah,
because of that, of course, he had to raise taxation, and the more he raised taxation, the more dissent there was, and the more dissent there was, the more he had to crack down on not just all the Hellenists, or the pagans, on the aristocrats, and all the competing
yeah,
Christianities that were in there. So yeah, he kind of had his work cut out.
yeah,
Um, so I can see that this building was very much handed down to trusted civil servants who were almost certainly steeped in Hellenistic literature and philosophy.
mhm,
And they probably took one glance at this building and they understood exactly what it exemplified. And it's the last thing they would say to anyone.
yeah, yeah,
Can imagine them standing on the gallery behind the emperor and the empress, with a sly smile on their face. So yeah, descent, it is a dissenting structure as well as a spiritually inspiring structure. And I think that again is a remarkable fusion to achieve.
Yeah, no, it really is, and you know, as I mentioned earlier, like the photographic selection,
Mm.
and the images, some of the images in the book, the monochromes. So I
Yeah,
believe possibly shot by Pierre Iskander as
that's right.
well as Hagia
Back in the day,
Sophia.
30s and 40s.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're very illustrative of the play of light and sound in the original building.
mm,
It has changed a lot now because it's reverted to a mosque.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I hope to, or wish to bring alive that aspect of the building as a sacred space using that black and white photography, and then to illustrate the evidence for my thesis with brand new color photography. You know, I was in there, actually directed, worked with the cameraman to get exactly the imagery we needed.
mm,
An award-winning photographer, Murat Palat, he's been a friend of mine for, I don't know,
fantastic.
25 years or so. He's done a beautiful job because the lighting conditions in there are extremely challenging.
Well, I mean, it's you're absolutely right, you know, and one of the things that kind of uh, I'm sorry to kind of labor this point about the photography in the book, but it's all of the images within the book, not just Pierre's kind of stuff, are hugely important in landing the thesis. Particularly for me, you know, when
Yeah.
I struggle with all these Greek words you use, Peter. You know, but it, it it it's like the light conditions now. It's permanently
Yeah.
illuminated inside. You know,
Yeah.
you get a sense from the mosaics what maybe the gold tesseract might have achieved,
Yeah.
but seeing it photographed without internal illumination, what the light looks like. I mean,
Mm.
hats off to Pierre because that was hard. It's hard to do with the technology he was using at the time to
Yeah.
get
Absolutely.
very good
Yeah.
exposure. But then the details as well, not just kind of the um, the the arachnids and the scorpions, but there's you know the goat headed
Yeah. We didn't talk about that actually.
no,
I
or the
can.
Poseidon.
Yeah, I can mention. I had a few words on that if you like.
Let's go for it.
On this notion that the building embodies a spiritual message, so to speak. Um, to complement this kind of thematic of the afterlife is the mechanism for escaping from repeated metapsychosis, from repeated incarnations. And in this tradition, that was initiation and theurgy. So when I looked at the southernmost pier, supporting pier, on its southern face, there were two images that really grabbed my attention. One, again, is the revetment, the cut of the marble panels to resemble Capricorn. And Capricorn is famously thought to be in the southerly solstice, where he appears as the Platonic gate of the sun by which souls ascend, whether through death or through the practice of theurgy. Okay, and they ascend in order to achieve henosis or union with the divinity. And immediately adjacent to that Capricorn-like marble panel, or two panels that resemble Capricorn, two embedded panels, and these are the only embedded panels I can see in the building. They have the trident and dolphins, which are the emblems of Poseidon on them. Now, Poseidon was the old city sea god, okay, but this was an age in which Justinian was actively suppressing Hellenistic belief and practice. It's extraordinary these panels were allowed there, that they're there in the dark gallery in the southern part of it. And when I checked the lineage of the designers back through Alexandria, back to Athens, through Proclus, the great metaphysician, of the school of Athens, sure enough, Poseidon is in his writings as the guide of souls. So what we have in this southerly portion of the building is a reference to theurgy and the role of theurgy as a mechanism to, so to speak, ascend and achieve union, henosis, with the divinity. And Plato is quite clear. There's a passage in the Republic where he says, and having achieved union with the deity, having achieved henosis, what is it that you should do? You should immediately descend again in order to bring spiritual enlightenment, basically, to others. Okay. So it's a very distinctive spiritual message on another level again, woven through this whole theme of recurrent afterlife visits and judgment and ascension as a process to return into incarnation on another level. It's extraordinary stuff, really is.
It's remarkable, and you know, and I got a real sense of the idea of responsibility.
Yeah.
From these people, and that was the kind of the term that I was trying to talk to earlier about, the idea of the golden chain and
Yeah.
individuals who they have that specific title, who come back to move the spiritual, maintain that line, and keep things moving.
That's right.
And when we look at then again the two mechanoi, almost there, I get that sense of like it's not just, you know, that this is you know, part of our faith, our beliefs, which is, you know, embedded in us, but it's responsibility to the beliefs.
Absolutely, it's not just another aqueduct. You know, this is architecture really running on another level conceptually, metaphysically, and spiritually. And you know, it makes me think about modern architecture really, and see maybe this is a project for the future, to look at it with a fresh eye.
Yeah.
To see how the spiritual tradition, so to speak, the esoteric vision in art and architecture has continued to move forward over the centuries.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Well, I mean, imagine kind of like modern brutalist architecture won't do itself any favors if it's examined through that prism. But yeah, I can imagine that would be an intriguing undertaking.
Certainly bears looking at. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And so famously, your work as centered around Saturn. You know, what is it that keeps bringing you back to that?
Oh, I mean, it has a frisson for me. The figure of Saturn. When we say Saturn, you see, the problem is that we tend to acclimatize that to astrology, to the planetary intelligence, which it has an overlap with. But for me, Saturn is Kronos, who is, you know, also Amun, the Egyptian god. And what we're talking about here is the deity as time, the time deity in all its manifestations in many cultures and transhistorically. Okay. And the reason it's important for me is that it brings into focus the issue of fate and destiny, which are intrinsically bound up with the Saturnian current. And in this sense, that if we can think of providence, the outreach of deity, as counterbalancing fate, which is ourselves bound in matter, the balance between these two derives your destiny in this life. So for me, my work is an exploration of the providential figure of the deity as time in its outreach.
Mm-hmm.
So we looked at, for instance, the form of the time deity as it manifests in, for instance, Dionysian worship in Mistai. We looked at it in terms of this Kronos Amun figure in the game of Saturn. And in this particular project, we're looking at the time deity as a providential mechanism for escaping from or relieving the pressure of fate, which drives the cycle of metapsychosis. So instead of being driven into metapsychosis, you take it as a choice. That's the balance between providence and fate. So we're all, in a sense, destined based upon the respective force or pull of providence and fate with each other to manifest a particular destiny in a particular lifetime. And that's essentially the Hagia Sophia is an articulation of the metaphysical machinery for that to take place. Okay. And the forthcoming work I'm embarked on at the moment, The Cult of Saturn, is an attempt to articulate the metaphysical mechanics in relationship to, for example, Mithraism. Again, the central deity of Mithraism. There was no such thing called Mithraism before 19th century scholarship invented that term. Okay. What there was is a cult of the deity as time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the forthcoming work I'm embarked on at the moment. So that's the unifying factor or feature of the work I do. You know, I hope that's clear now. Clear as mud.
We'll do our best. We'll do our best to understand. You know, it's tricky enough. I must add, while Peter jests about being clear as mud, I averaged having to go to a dictionary at least once to twice per page for at least the first 50 pages of your book.
Oh, sorry about that.
Don't be sorry. Don't apologize. My intellectual limitations are not your problem, Peter.
I must say, I do try to write with a certain style to make the experience of reading more than just functional.
That's so apparent.
To try and have a harmony or musicality in the sentence. So it has an aesthetic.
Yeah.
As well as a information bearing kind of load. But as you say, sometimes it gets overloaded.
But no,
these are books you can pick up and read and read and read again.
Well, I'm looking forward to my copy. I pre-ordered it when it first came out, just before Christmas. From the Scarlets, so I'm really looking forward to it. And what was I going to say? There is a sense of the sacred to it, you know, but thinking of kind of your other works, like how this fits together, it's. I was reflecting on this the other evening about kind of what the experience is like reading the book, you know, and in part, it's kind of like one part listening to or reading a great history book, but it's also, I feel a little bit like that. I've got you kind of got Indiana Jones' dad's notebook from the Last Crusade with all the clues. It's got that kind of, there's just You got a
It
sense of
was like that to write it. I have to tell you.
yeah, I can
You know, all
imagine.
my books start out with a blank, and I don't know where they're going to go.
Yeah, no, yeah, I know what
I
you mean.
embark on these projects. They, you know, like Game of Saturn was like 3 years of continuous work. I didn't know where it was going. I couldn't. I knew there was something about those damn cards that
Yeah.
I couldn't put my finger on, and I had a scent
Mm.
of something there, but I just couldn't figure out how to decode them or what they meant. You know, I just stayed with it.
Yeah.
And that's how I do these projects. So they do tend to throw up extraordinary things
Yeah.
when you follow your instincts, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a wonderful endeavor again, you know.
Mm.
We should mention as well. You've got like them some really great supporting appendices in it as well, which
Oh,
do
right. Yeah.
they
Yeah.
they add a lot of ballast to what you're saying with like the astrological work, and then the kind of
Yeah. Yeah. Good friend of ours here did the elective chart for the inauguration of the building and of the inauguration of the building itself. So, you know, the start of construction and the inauguration of the building. So we have included the elective chart for the start of the building, and that shows that they didn't choose the optimal date for this, which would have been 6, 7 months later. They chose the most proximate date on which all the factors were as positive as it's possible to be. And again, it just underlines Justinian's urgency to get the project going. Nevertheless, if I only knew the stages of Byzantine construction, we could probably do an elective chart for each stage, and you would probably find they would be waiting specifically for that alignment of celestial influences as they went forward with the construction.
incredible.
So I wanted to demonstrate actually that the astrology is important in the building process. The alignment of celestial forces was absolutely part of the calculation in you know undertaking this massive project. The other appendix is from Harper Feist of the Lima Now podcast. Um, and since she's an expert with light and lasers and the mathematics of those things, she was very kindly written an appendix about the reflective properties of the original dome. Okay, so that is in there as well, and it provides a little harder edged writing than I certainly am capable of. So thanks to both of those people for doing that work for me. I was very pleased with it, and I think it added something extra that
Okay.
I certainly couldn't.
Mm. No, definitely, you know, and I really like it really makes me think about what the sensory experience must have been like under that original dome. You
Yeah.
know, like
Again, I point people towards the icons of sound
mm,
video clip on YouTube. There has footage shot inside the building as the hymn is sung.
mm,
And that's as close as you can get to that immersive,
mm,
multi-sensory aesthetic experience that the designers built this machine to generate.
yeah, um, yeah, it was like I get the sense of this golden haze, you know,
Yeah,
what it must have looked like when you go in there, and certainly I'll make sure that the photographs are embedded in this video so people can get a sense of that these great magnificent beams of light cutting through the building. In
yeah.
landscape photography, we call that kind of stuff godlight. You know,
You're right.
sure, like when you get a
True in more than one sense in this
yes,
case.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, as I said, kind of it's a wonderful, wonderful book. You know, and thank you for your endeavors in bringing it out. You know, and as you said,
Well, thanks to Scarlet Imprint, they've done a wonderful job on the design, as usual,
they always
the
do.
editing, and
Yeah.
everything else. Yeah,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
yeah.
Really beautiful.
Hats off to the team at Scarlet Imprint. Pete Alkistis.
Smashed it again. So
Yeah.
when is the
Paul
heart?
Holman as well. Sorry,
Yeah.
must
Yeah,
mention
that's
Paul
fine.
Holman,
Yeah.
editor. Sorry, you were going to say?
I know the pre-orders have gone out. Well, when will the hard copies arrive?
Yeah, I think today.
Really? Oh, awesome.
Possibly, yeah, yeah.
Fantastic.
I think the paperbacks were there last week, like Wednesday or Thursday,
Yeah.
and all being well, I think the hardbacks were expected today.
Fantastic.
Don't hold me to that, but
I'll be expecting mail, next week now.
fingers crossed. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the printed version myself.
I can
Yeah,
imagine. And so you do have another project in the post, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I'm hard at it.
yeah,
We'll see. That will be realized with Theon
that's right.
Publishing.
Yeah.
And the reason is simply that, I've got a new project and the previous one isn't out yet from Scarlet Imprint.
Yeah.
So they said, with our blessings, go ahead. You know, it would just be too long for
Yeah,
me as a professional author
sure.
to have to wait before they could schedule it.
And can you
So
give us
something like 2 years or something,
yeah, yeah,
they just said, no, go ahead with it. It's, this is something very much, that you need to
get done.
complete. So it's a continuation of the game of Saturn, but on a deeper level now. We're going to start really digging out the metaphysics of the time deity and the practices, the actual performative practices associated with it. So I'll be looking at different cult embodiments of this Saturnian current over time. Okay, so
Is this something that you practice yourself, Peter? I mean, feel free to ignore that question. But
well,
we talk about theology.
I've done energy work. I've been doing since I was like 15.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I trained in Shotokan karate in my teens, and the teacher was a very exceptional practitioner.
Yeah.
Um, really one of Britain's top
Oh, wow.
guys. He's also the trainer of the SAS, having been formerly a member of that regiment.
Mm.
Um, and his insight into the use of energy was absolutely phenomenal, both as a offensive weapon and as a healing art. Okay, because you're dealing with the same meridian system.
Mm.
Okay, but there's two different applications, therefore, of how you interact with it. And then I went on to do Tai Chi, which again is an extended exercise in breath, movement, energy coordination, essentially. Okay. And from there, I kind of did like 20 odd years of energy based healing work. My own speciality was very much rebirthing breath work.
Mm.
And on top of that, of course, took various initiatory transmissions.
Mm.
So I kind of have built up a mass, and also my interest in ethnography and comparative anthropology. So the background in energy work has provided me with a very unique way of relating to cult practice, ritual practice. Okay, so I can look at the symbolism in a different way, in an operative way. I don't have to think of it in terms of its literary precedence or literary derivation. That's important, but that's scholarship. It's not the same thing as what these cults, like what we call Mithraism, were designed to do, or indeed the initiation of Eleusis, or the Dionysian Telestic initiation explored in Mystae. These are all energy-based initiatory practices. They involve a deity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the, like the internal power which you get with most of the martial arts. You now have external power sources. So, I've been a Reiki practitioner for 20 odd years. So I work with spiritual energies. I see energies and have done, just one anecdote out of many I can just give you, because I had no personal engagement or involvement in this whatsoever. But I was dragged along to see this guy, and he has this most phenomenal multi-octave singing, and he has a connection to these beings he calls the Hathors. He calls them higher order beings or entities. Tom Kenyon is his name. And I went along there, and there he was. We were in a like amphitheater. He was on the stage with a chair, just sat there, and he starts singing, And all of a sudden, I see these tall columns of light around him, like half a dozen of them. They must have gone up 20, 30 meters in the air, And then after a time, they drifted off the apron of the stage and up through the auditorium. Like one passed right through me, and they disappeared. Wow. I thought, well, that's strange, isn't it? But at the end of this thing, somebody in the audience said, well, Tom, what do these beings look like? He said, oh, when they manifest, you'll see them as tall columns of light. Okay. So, it's just one anecdote out of many. This wasn't in a healing context. We had so many contacts and connections, writing the books or doing the healing work. And of course, doing intensive healing work for that many years brings you in contact with other very gifted healers who have very special, a lot of this material is covered in the Power of the Healing Field from inner traditions, which came out, beginning of last year. It's in paperback, it's on Kindle. Anybody wants to see the connection between energy, healing, and otherworldly beings should check that book out. That for me is like the ground zero. If you're into esoterics, if you're trying to develop your esoteric life or magical practice, that's like the ground zero is the healing practices in there, energy-based healing.
Yeah,
it'll connect you faster than almost anything else.
Yeah, one of the things I particularly like about that book, I literally have a copy on the bookshelf on my shoulder here,
Right.
is you make the point that it's really important to do the healing work, that you are a more complete, you've got less fissures where things can go wrong.
Yeah.
You begin a magical practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it takes you into that sphere of responsibility for others. Okay. And that really counterbalances any tendency to get self-absorbed or feel depressed. When you take a proactive, caring role with other people, it changes the equation fundamentally in your life. Okay, that's a developmental step.
I think that kind of thing is so, not just important in a kind of a blasé way, but it's at total odds with the idea of power, magical power in, kind of like a pop culture sense, or, or topographical sense that you'd get from social media, which tends to be very egoistic in my experience.
Mind you, that said, when you look at, for instance, classic texts like the Abramelin text, right? What does it start off with? Well, it starts off with 6 months, 9 months of theurgy.
Yeah.
Actually. And he says that's the necessary prerequisite to the kind of operative magic that flows on afterwards. Okay. So, it is there in the tradition, this balance. But of course, to make that kind of commitment, like the Abramelin text said, you just sequester yourself for 6 months, and you don't talk to anyone, and you don't go out, and it's a pretty tall order in today's world.
Sounds wonderful, to be honest.
You go mad. So what you can do is start to do things like healing practice,
Mhm.
healing other people, learning these skills, working on yourself. That will be a developmental path that parallels what he's doing with Abramelin. And then, as the purification takes place, you start to engage with otherworldly beings anyway.
Yeah.
They're of the positive kind, like these Hathors, I have no engagement with them whatsoever, but they were there. It's almost as though they chose to manifest, but not to interact. That was interesting. So you gain a respect for the agency on the other side, and this goes for like ghost hunting as well. Like it's not just entertainment, it's not just hunting activity. There's people genuinely trapped between worlds. Okay, something has gone wrong with their process of dying. And there's a huge opportunity there for people to work with these kinds of people, interact with them, and make the transitions.
Mhm.
Now, of course, that will also expose you to demonic forces, parasitic forces, I would call them. And again, if you're doing intense energy healing work, you're going to encounter some of them intensely parasitic forces. And this brings up the whole question of why certain people become obsessed with them. What is the role of karma? What is it unresolved in their larger trans lifetime of issues that is not resolved, or in their ancestral line, for instance? So starting with the healing practice immediately begins to draw you into deep waters, but also empower you to deal with them.
Yeah.
So it's hands-on, real learning with the other world on
Yeah.
an ongoing basis. So it's closer to the original shamanism than anything else. When you look at shaman practice worldwide in a traditional context, 90% of it is to do with healing or communal healing.
Yeah.
It's not to do with just invoking or evoking a spirit for idle entertainment. It's part of a
Very
community's
much a community function.
health,
Yeah.
its life, its connection to life and death, how it copes and evolves. So there's a real serious edge to these practices when they're dealt with in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would definitely encourage um, people to pick up a copy of that book. I mean, I've I've studied Reiki for a long time, come to 20 years myself now.
Yeah.
But I certainly thought there was a lot of reflections and advice and positions that you presented that really broadened the scope, you know, of energy healing more broadly, but also Reiki. So it's a fantastic book. You know,
Thank you.
you know. Before we wrap up, so I'm conscious it's a little bit later, um, where you are, in sight of the Hagia Sophia. Uh,
More or less.
Wonderful. Um, um, when you when you were in the building, right?
Mm.
And you're in the building, you're kind of walking around it, and I know we've discussed in kind of different periods and through our correspondence how things manifest themselves, ideas, direction. When you get that kind of gentle nudge, you're shepherded over to a certain area to observe this particular thing,
Yeah.
or you get shoved between the shoulder blades in a certain
Right.
direction. How did that manifest for you?
Well, I
That
think I was just like shoved along from
yeah,
beginning to end with this project.
right,
When you think about it, the revetment has been studied for the last 100 years of scholarship. But nobody has seen the patterns in it or made sense of them up to now. I don't think I'm a genius, but something is pushing me along. And one of the things I kind of semi-notice is the slippage that takes place in the quality of your awareness when you engage with these topics. So that there's, so to speak, that rational focused sensibility. And then there's a sensibility in which that is kind of overcome, and you lose the temporal and, to a certain extent, spatial awareness, and you're absorbing an aesthetic sense of the place. It's difficult to describe, but there's definitely a suspension of normal temporal and spatial awareness, and a different form of awareness becomes dominant. And it's far more about association than it is focused, so to speak. So it kind of rapidly assimilates a space as a totality, as a totality that is acting on you in a certain way. And I think that for me is the kind of aesthetic sensibility that enabled me to take in. Because when you go in the building, it's vast. And I mean, talk about the floor is a marble sea. I mean, it disappears to the edge of the building, and your awareness is like drawn up constantly into this complex of domes, semi-domes, exedra, and certainly at the time I was doing the research, it wasn't carpeted, so they had this echoing sound all the time around you, especially with like the shuffling of people in the galleries and around, and this huge sustain. So it's very easy to lose your sense of where you are in the building, your like orientation, and what it is you're looking at, because like for instance the vast supporting, 4 massive supporting pillars, I counted it, they have like 14 faces on each one. Okay, so depending where you're standing in relation to them, there's such a complexity of echoing and reflective surface everywhere. Okay, so the space itself is not easy to assimilate. You need to live here and be able to access it for hours on end, as I did. Yeah. Just being there in this like associative mind space, taking it in as a complete, as a whole, rather than some portion or corner that you're like stuck in. I think that was important. And without that, you're unlikely to have picked up the cues that I picked up.
Right.
Okay, so if you're going in with, like you're visiting scholar, you've got an hour, something, and you want to see as much, and you want to take in the mosaics that are now there, and this, that, and the other, you're going to have a far more focused and directed tour of the thing. Okay, that's not the way I engaged with this space at all. Literally was able to go in and just be there and allow it to, so to speak to me in its own measured way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk with you, Dara.
Likewise. And for everybody who wants to pick up a copy of this phenomenal book, indeed all your books, where's the best for them to?
Yeah, Scarlet Imprint is the go-to place.
Wonderful. We'll put the link in the show notes. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Enjoy.
Thank you, Peter. What a wonderful show. I hugely enjoyed that. Peter is one of my favorite magical people, one of my favorite guests to have on the show. He's always so erudite and knowledgeable, a true gentleman and a scholar. So I encourage you all to do follow Peter's work, and his books are exceptional, so do check them out. I think they're really they're things of beauty. They have an air of the sacred about them themselves, which is to be expected from Scarlet Imprint. Now, before we wrap up the show, I've left a link in the show notes to Peter's book, The Power of the Healing Field. If you were remotely interested in energy healing in any shape or form whatsoever, I really, really suggest you look at this title. If you're a practitioner, it will help inform your practice. If you're not a practitioner and you want to go about getting healing, this is a very good framing for your understanding of what it can do for you. Really, really good book. Really excellent title. Right, I'm going to leave it there. I'm Dara Mason. You've been listening to The Spirit Box. Talk soon and take care. Bye.